Dear sisters and brothers in Christ, wish you all a happy Easter. In the liturgy, keeping vigil, we celebrate the resurrection of the Lord in 4 parts. 1. The blessing of the new fire and the Paschal proclamation. 2. The liturgy of the word. 3. The blessing of water, baptism if any, and the renewal of the baptismal vows. 4. The liturgy of the breaking of the bread and thus the continuation of the Holy Mass. The parts of the Easter Vigil, such as fire, light, and water, are in fact symbols of the risen one. The fire purifies and gives light, and water gives life. By baptism, we have been purified, light has been given to us, and we have been given new life. In the liturgy of the word, the 7 readings from the Old Testament summarize the whole of the history of salvation as to how it was prepared by God meticulously, culminating then in the granting of His Son for our salvation. Our meditation will be centered on the Gospel passage, which is Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 to 10, and reading from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 6, verses 3 to 11. 1. The Gospel passage brings forth a story of 2 women. When Jesus had been arrested, the men disciples had dispersed. They were all scattered. Matthew tells of the burial of Jesus, which was witnessed by women disciples, as said in chapter 27, verses 59 to 61. In verse 61, it is said, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. Since it was Friday evening, all left for the Sabbath rest. Then Matthew says in chapter 28, verse 1, After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. The behavior of these women seems somewhat strange. Why do they come so early in the morning to see the tomb? According to Mark and Luke, they had come with spices to anoint the body of Jesus, which was buried 2 days back. Would not the body be already decomposing? We should remember here that the sisters of Lazarus had told Jesus that Lazarus' body was already in the tomb for 4 days and that there would be stench when Jesus told them to remove the stone which covered the opening of the tomb. Anyway, in Matthew, it is only said that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came just to see the tomb. All the same, what is implied is that they could not do all the funerary honors to Jesus, their master and great friend, when he was buried, having been brutally killed. Their love for him goes beyond death and beyond the tomb. Hence, they have to see the tomb as soon as the day breaks. Solomon had sung in his Song of Songs, Love is strong as death, Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 6. But when they came to see the tomb, they did not see the dead body of Jesus. What they saw was the empty tomb, and what they heard was the good news of resurrection and then the resurrected one himself. This is in fact the reward of love, which goes beyond death and beyond the tomb. And now too, Professor John P. Meyer, who has written 4 large volumes entitled Jesus the Marginal Jew, argues, and that rightly, the fact that the Gospels present women as the witnesses of the resurrection adds credibility to the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. This is because if the resurrection were a cooked-up story, then men disciples would have been made the witnesses. For the Jews, only the witnesses of men were considered as trustworthy and not that of women. Now that women were the witnesses, the fact is truly represented in the narration. Hence, anyone has reason to believe it. And this is not a story, but history that has to be believed. 3. This is something to be proclaimed. One has to bear witness to the fact. The verb to see is several times repeated in this passage of 10 verses. They went to see. Verse 1, come and see the place where he lay. Verse 6, you will see him there in Galilee. Verses 7 and 10. The resurrection is a fact which the whole community of believers should witness and proclaim. It's a good news to be shared. Church is a community of witnesses. That's the reason why Pope Francis continuously says that we are all missionary disciples. Now 4. The resurrection is both a frightening and joy-giving reality. It is said, so they left the tomb, the two women, quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Verse 8. There is fear, but this fear is something which gives joy and it energizes. In verse 4 here, it is said that the soldiers became like dead men on account of fear, on account of the resurrection event. They are not the ones who believed the resurrection. Therefore, for them, resurrection became a frightening and deadly sickening reality. Now Jesus himself, the risen one, appeared to the women and greeted them saying, Hyrete in Greek, which literally means rejoice, be glad, although it is generally rendered as greetings. He told them not to be afraid. They could rejoice as he had defeated death. He had won over death and darkness. Hence, Christians should be a group of people who live here on earth with joy and not frightened. We are an Easter people. Nothing can defeat us. Suffering, pain, sickness, or even death. We are able to overcome all this with Jesus, the resurrected one who has defeated all the other powers. Finally, 5. This is the third day of the Paschal Triduum. In fact, the Passion, death, and the resurrection of the Lord constitute an integral whole, one reality. They are just one reality for us. This is what St. Paul tells in his letter to Romans, the portion of which we have heard in the reading from the New Testament. He says that in baptism we have died with Christ and have been buried with him, so that we might walk in newness of life. The text of Romans 6:4 is quite significant in this regard. St. Paul says, therefore we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. As for Paul, resurrection is something of the future, but we have died and have been buried with Christ in baptism, so that we are able to live a new way of life, the culmination of which will be the resurrection. This walking in newness of life is the ethical life for the Christian. This way of life for the Christian is the fruit of the resurrection. Our choice of goodness, of the way of earnestly embracing love for our brothers and sisters, avoiding all that is evil, is in fact the signs of resurrection. It's a way of defeating death. It's faith working through love. Indeed, faith cannot be stagnant and inactive. It has to be active and dynamic in love. A faith which is active in love is an indication of the life of resurrection, of living in newness of life. Dear friends, resurrection is a story of love. Love of a few women whose love went beyond death, and they were rewarded by the vision of the risen one. Resurrection of Christ is a historical fact, and it has to be witnessed by us. It's a frightening and joyful reality. We are an Easter people. Resurrection is the basis of our new way of life. It's the cause of our ethical life. Let our faith then be one which manifests itself in love. Amen.